Our topic tonight is the election of 2016 and American foreign policy to come. And I think before we get onto that, all of us would like to remember what happened today in Brussels. I'm sure many people in the audience, as well as many of us, have been to Brussels, have memories of the city, have many friends there, and it just reminds us all, I think, what a sober task awaits the next president of the United States. But meanwhile, in the United States, we're having an election, and I suppose that means that by November we'll have a president.
Hasn't always worked out like that.
No, it hasn't. Or maybe we'll have, that's an interesting thought. What if we still have 8 members of the Supreme Court? And we get a tie vote on the Supreme Court. This could be really fun. But as you think about it, how is foreign policy going to affect the election? Because I think a couple of years ago, people might have thought that foreign policy wouldn't be a factor. I think in many ways it already has been a pretty significant factor in this year's election. What do you think we'll be looking at in November? Well, you want to start us off, Carl?
Well, you said sobering, and there's so little sobriety in the American campaign so far. I was sitting today and I was looking at the Council on Foreign Relations. This is, they didn't pay me to say this, but it has a really interesting tool in which you can compare the positions of the different candidates. Sorry, that's not me, it's them. Okay. The Council has an interesting tool. You can go online and you can compare the different positions of the different candidates on key national security issues. And it is a depressing exercise, truly a depressing exercise. I mean, if you look at that, I mean, there's absolutely no enlightened position on trade among any of them on that. And then we have things like making the sand glow, and I would have negotiated better, and you're going to get so tired of winning because we're winning so much.
Is that actually on the Council website, making the sand glow?
Well, Ted Cruz said it. They didn't make it up.
So it's on the website?
It's under energy policy.
Very good. That's an interesting question. Did the Council leave that off? I know he said it, though. And so I think what's so interesting is we live in a really incredibly dangerous world right now. There are so many incredible challenges. The Obama administration has been negligent on so many fronts and has done good things on others, certainly the Iran deal, but terribly negligent on things like Syria. And there is not a foreign policy debate going on right now. It's the same screaming that's going on. And within the Democratic Party, Secretary Clinton, who has considerable experience on foreign affairs and I think is a very smart person, is really not playing to that strength. One hopes she will play to that strength in the general election, but we'll see. So far, she's not really doing it.
Well, what's interesting is 4 years ago, if you had been following the campaign, certainly the Obama administration's line, we had solved all of our basic foreign policy challenges. I mean, think of some of the slogans of just 4 years ago. Relations with Russia, reset. Al-Qaeda on a path to defeat. Iraq, responsible withdrawal. Afghanistan, similarly, a responsible phased withdrawal. The task ahead for the next president, to turn a corner on a decade of war, see the tide of war recede, and focus on nation building at home. And now when I mention these, and I'm simply quoting the president or his senior advisors, they seem almost completely laughable, these sorts of predictions. So foreign policy has returned in a big way to the American consciousness. And you can imagine, I think more than a few of us in this room probably fear a situation where in October, a Paris-style attack, whether in Europe or God forbid, in the United States, could tilt the election in favor of the candidate who promises to, torture them the most or whatever, make the sands glow the most. So foreign policy, I think, is back in the American mind. The problem is the American mind. In two senses. I mean, first, there's a possibility we will lose our mind. But secondly, there is, I think, fundamentally a question about whether Americans want to pursue the broad contours of the foreign policy that have been the staples of American presidents, Democratic as well as Republican, since the days of Harry Truman. I mean, to listen to Donald Trump or read the transcript of his remarks with the Washington Post is to see that in some ways he is an extension, not a rejection, but an extension of some of the trends that were set in motion under President Obama. President Obama, I call it retreat, he would call it retrenchment, but was a president who basically felt that the United States was overextended abroad, that between foreign policy and domestic policy there was a zero-sum choice. You either did one or the other, but you couldn't do both. And the important task for the president was to work on our problems at home. Well, Donald Trump is essentially saying the same thing. To him, it's all winners and losers, and right now we're the big losers. One of the stupider remarks of all time, but it seems to be carrying him far. And so really the question that we're confronting is the same question that was confronting the United States in the late 1930s and very early 1940s. Donald Trump is the candidate that America First never quite found. And he's back. And this debate between, frankly, the new isolationists and the internationalists, whether it's someone more to Carla's side or Gideon's side or mine, I think that's the real debate taking place on the foreign policy stage.
I was planning to be nice to Bret because he's a buddy and because I feel sorry for what's happening to his party and making him defend it. But
I thought there was a but coming, Gideon.
But I think that's hooey. I mean, the idea that this is actually a substantive debate is silly because although it's absolutely true what he said about Trump's lunacy as demonstrated in the Washington Post editorial board interview, which is absolutely must-reading because it's the first time Trump has actually said anything extended on substance, and it reveals that he's not just an ignoramus, but he's also a mercantilist of the first order and has all the views that Bret just attributed to him, ruling him out if there wasn't already a lot of other reasons to rule him out. But the trend is not so much that this is a continuation of the Obama retreat. This is a continuation of, I mean, Trump is nothing but Sarah Palin with worse hair. So this is a trend of know-nothingism in the Republican Party, not of retreat from the international order for the last 5 years. Hillary Clinton, like Barack Obama, is squarely in the foreign policy tradition of the last 75 years, and modest retrenchment to save the core, as somebody wrote in Foreign Affairs and has borne out in the Goldberg interview in The Atlantic, is not the same thing as walking away from global leadership entirely. And I think that the real story of foreign policy in this election for me is that, look, for the last 2-3 decades, on the Republican side at least, tax policy, fiscal policy has essentially been removed from the realm of serious policy discussion, with ever more ludicrous promises made and conventional accounting methods thrown out the window, so it becomes a fantasy of who can promise more. No one actually looks at the Republican tax plans these days and sees them as realistic plans for government, because they're not. The Democrats are still trying, and to the Democratic wonks' credit, when Sanders came up with something equally loony, the Democratic wonks attacked him for it, which was very impressive. But the real story is that now foreign policy in this cycle has gone fully over into the same fantasy land that domestic policy or fiscal policy has gone over, in the sense that the discussion that has been featured mostly in the campaign on the Republican side, as Carla's right, it's been ignored on the Democratic side, but it's been featured on the Republican side, has been as contentless and substanceless as the discussions of, let's say, tax policy and fiscal policy.
But not without cost, because we can sit here and talk about what they're saying and look at it as it is amusing in a really terrifying way. But what messages are being sent abroad? What does Putin hear when Trump says, what a great guy, what a natural affinity we have?
What is the actual cost? I can think of one significant cost, which is...
Why should I forget what foreigners are
because
saying?
Because
they're listening.
It's not because it's not ultimately going to be translated into policy. They're not ultimately going to win, and it will blow over. And people know to sort of turn off the election sound.
I don't think that's true. I think that there is, the searing experience of living through the George W. Bush administration and torture and all of these these other things, and to hear that a hugely popular candidate is talking that way again, to hear Ted Cruz implying that he's going to use nuclear weapons and make the sand glow, I think that has an impact. I don't think people are, sadly, I don't think they're discounting it as much as you say.
I think the real effect, the real cost, and it's actually dawning on me that it's probable at this point, is TPP is probably dead. And I think that is astonishing. It may not be the best trade agreement out there. It may not be a major one, but it's a significant step forward in the liberal order that we've been talking about for 75 years. It's a major positive thing for the Pacific and the world. And I don't see how, with all the talk on both sides of the aisle during this campaign, Congress actually goes through this year and passes it, which is a
Brett,
some of it depends on who controls the
this idea that the
Senate.
Republican debate has gone into fantasy land now on foreign policy as much as on tax policy. How would you?
Well,
how would you respond
listening to
that?
Gideon was like reading a Paul Krugman column, but without
without the Nobel Prize.
but without the saving wit and cutting sense of humor.
Sense of self-deprecation.
Yeah, there was something of that. I was tempted to say, Gideon, you ignorant slut, but that's an old
Something
joke.
he could never say to me.
I almost said something there.
That's a Saturday Night Live reference. It's not a sexist joke. It's a Saturday Night Live reference.
It's a Wall Street Journal thing.
So, look.
I know your mother's in the audience, and you're using that mouth?
Oh, you should hear her sometimes. No, my mother is the soul of propriety. Look, you know, we had an interesting exchange, Gideon and I, in the pages of Foreign Affairs, where he put forward the amazing idea that Barack Obama had been a pretty good foreign policy president, which is just one of the most astonishing, it was one of the most astonishing verbal performances or written performances I had ever seen, because it's extraordinarily difficult to look at the shambles of American foreign policy today, or, as I am sure you do, and you know this perfectly well, talk to any senior leader anywhere else in the world and ask yourself, are we better off today in the world? Is the United States better respected? Can we better exercise influence and power? And say, yes, we're in a better position now than we were even in 2008. And the fact is that Barack Obama's presidency did represent, in many respects, a quiet but fundamental departure from the contours of American foreign policy in the post-war age. When Barack Obama talked about nation building at home, the implicit contrast was, we can't do the nation building abroad. Of course, he was borrowing the line from Tom Friedman. I don't know what that tells you. This was a fundamental shift. This was the thinking that American presidents can't do both. And Obama constantly spoke in the language of American limitations, of what America can't do, of why America can't be there. By the way, I don't know what Jeffrey Goldberg article you were reading. It was clearly not the same one. You wrote me a very nice note about my column.
I thought it was well written.
About Jeff Goldberg.
He can write.
And I appreciate that. But what Goldberg clearly has the president saying, okay, is we live in a world where most of our allies are just pure freeloaders. They need to do more for themselves. The Middle East is an unfixable mess, and the sooner we get out of it, the better. His idea of an Iran deal is essentially something like the Paris Peace Accord of 1973, a face-saving agreement on the way out the door.
Do we get to rebut this?
Yes,
absolutely, absolutely. Now, Carla, you are going to get full opportunity.
And I use the word
and that
negligent.
is the essence of the Obama doctrine: a shrunken America with a shrunken footprint, unable and unwilling to exercise its former role in the world. Now, Donald Trump has just taken that a further step in terms of its coarseness and vulgarity.
Carla, I think, really wants.
Ladies first.
I would never use the word coarse or vulgar about President Obama, but I did use the word negligent when I was talking about Syria. That said, I don't think that the Obama foreign policy is retreat everywhere, and I think a lot of Americans have a lot of sympathy for what a mess the Middle East is, if only we could get out of it. The mistake they made was when people told them what was going on in Iraq, they covered their ears and sang the Star-Spangled Banner, and they ignored what was going on in Syria. All of that I will give you. That said, the Iran deal is not some great surrender. I think that it's a hell of a lot better than the alternative, since everyone knew that bombing them would buy you a couple of years and that would be it. And there's a lot of people watching, and there's been, there's a possibility there. I'm not saying it's going to work, but there's a possibility there. Obama's in Cuba. Why did he go to Cuba? Because the Latin American president said to him, it's time that the United States stops isolating himself. Obama's willingness to talk to people and reach out to people is not a sign of weakness necessarily. He's weak on Syria. He's weak in other places, but his willingness to engage is also not a retreat from leadership. I think that is the notion of American leadership in the 21st century. It's just that you can't do one and say, Syria, gee, that's too hard, I'm not going to do it. Just think how much better it would be if he could engage allies and at the same time provide leadership on the ground in Syria, or at least from the air.
The last Republican president who knew anything about foreign policy had a signature line that was mocked on Saturday Night Live by Dana Carvey, not going to do it, wouldn't be prudent. The wisdom
Are you talking about HW?
HW.
Got it.
The wisdom of not doing things because it wouldn't be prudent is something the Republican Party used to understand. They lost that, and the Democrats, at least some of them, hopefully including the next Democratic president, although I'm not sure about her, at least under Obama, have recaptured some of that. And the idea that sort of discretion is the better part of valor, that if you can't make something better, and getting trapped and squandering a vast amount of blood, treasure, and reputation in fruitless causes is the only option, then maybe staying out is a good thing. Maybe letting some local actors do things for themselves or try to solve their problems in areas of the world that are not absolutely core and critical.
Would you say Syria is not core and critical?
Yes. Syria is a very difficult situation, undergoing an absolutely tragic civil war. But the idea that Syria is itself absolutely core to American national security interests has never been a significant priority of American foreign policy. When Papa Assad slaughtered tens of thousands in Hama, now what it has evolved into now.
Syria in chaos is the question. Syria in chaos.
Syria in chaos is a major
security?
Syria in chaos is a major regional problem.
Nobody
has any particularly good answers to that regional problem. And banking the coals and trying to put pressure to push things back gradually over time is at least as sort of non-screwy an approach to it as all the other approaches that have been.
I find it amazing and actually useful for my purposes that you're citing George H.W. Bush as your ideal of a foreign policy president. And he was, in fact, he had incredible accomplishments. He sent 500,000 troops into the into the Middle East to do something that was incredibly, we all are old enough to remember this, incredibly controversial at the time. He sent in
after rallying a multilateral coalition.
Absolutely, but it was very clear that he was going to do this. He sent in troops unilaterally without notifying Congress in order to depose Manuel Noriega. Less felicitously, he also sent in about 20,000 American troops into Somalia to relieve a famine there. So to use George H.W. Bush as your model is not a particularly good advertisement, because he was, if anything, quite an interventionist.
I'm going to do, speaking of being an interventionist now, all right, our panel, our subject is really the future, but we keep going back further into the past. And I wonder if we could actually just sort of think, okay, it's January 2017, and a new president, he or she, perhaps at this point it's more sort of numerically or probabilistically accurate to say she or he, looks around the world. What do you think the first, priorities of the new president are going to be?
Hillary
and
Clinton
what
will
should they
maintain
be?
the broad outlines of Obama's foreign policy, and in the long run, we'll all thank her for it. There'll be some twitches on the side and tweaks here and there. She'll have to sound a little bit tougher on trade. She'll have to be a little bit more hawkish on ISIS. But by and large, the broad outlines of Obama's foreign policy will continue, and that'll be a good thing.
So will the world be as much worse off in 2024 compared to 2016 as it is in 2016 compared to 2008?
What Bret has failed to point out is that the other parts of the world, particularly our enemies or our frenemies, are failing dramatically faster than we are. And if you were to say China is facing slowing growth and a political crisis and is much weaker than anybody assumes, and over the next decade will have a terrible decade. Russia is already contracting, is facing no significant future, and will face an even worse decade than China. The most interesting question I could pose out there now is, who do you think will be in control of his country longer, Xi or Putin? Because both of them are going to go at some point, and both of them, and it's going to be over the next decade.
By Xi, you meant Xi Jinping, not Xi Hillary Clinton.
So Russia, and if anybody who would trade the United States, growing at the largest...
We're going to have trouble with this, by the way. She said...
Anybody who would trade the United States, the safest country, largest power, the dominant power in the entire globe, growing at a faster pace than any other developed economy, with essentially a fairly secure, steady docket. With any other power. Europe is in internal crisis. The Middle East is just falling apart. No, but I'm saying the United States is actually doing extremely well.
They're weak and we're strong, right?
Our problem is going to, over the next decade, is going to be how to dampen and insulate ourselves from the ripple effects of major political turmoil in bad countries, whether in the Middle East or in Russia or in China.
Good countries too,
like where?
The EU.
The EU, but the other, yes, the EU to a certain extent.
Or Japan.
No, why Japan?
Look,
what's wrong with Japan?
I have no, I mean, anyone who reads my column knows how much I detest the current Republican frontrunner. But your description of the world and your description of the American economy now is an excellent advertisement for Trump's view that the establishment is so out to lunch that there needs to be a revolution in this country.
Because 4.9% employment is actually a bad thing?
Because we have a labor participation rate that's about 7 percentage points lower than it was before the beginning of the Great Recession. And anyone who knows anything about the economic picture understands that the unemployment rate is not the full measure of employment. In fact, your friend Paul Krugman has been making this point for quite some time. It's the labor participation rate that counts. We historically, in the post-war period, had 3% or more growth. We now have 2%. We're lucky to have 2% growth. So for you to claim that this is a sign of how good things are going, how well things are going, it suggests the yawning gap between the so-called elites and the rest of the country. Now,
okay, Bret. Now, Carla has promised to answer my question, so I want to let, and then I'm going to let you answer my question. But Carla, why don't you?
I agree with Gideon that Putin is in a weak situation. The Chinese are going to have a very bad decade, and I think that doesn't make me feel safe and secure. I think managing a China that is far more likely to be threatening to its neighbors because it's contracting economically is in many ways much more frightening than a secure and growing China. Russia, and I think the experience in Ukraine is a really interesting one, because it's an interesting one for what it also tells you about Europe, is that there was the immediate response, and that does go to the criticism of our allies. The immediate response, and if you look at the Pew polling, is when Ukraine happened, and then what are you going to have to do if you invoke Article 5 for the Balts? Most people in Europe, their first reaction was, gee, I don't want to go fight for those people. I don't want to go fight for our alliance. And so even Europe, which is going to be under a huge amount of stress, and as weak as Putin is, he may try to take advantage of that. I think repairing alliances so that we can manage to, I know it sounds traditional and very, so that we can manage a Russia that's potentially going to be destabilized and a China that's going to be contracting is, to my mind, one of the number one things, and managing ISIL. And I think you can only do that in an alliance as well, with allies who are pretty weak.
Bret, what's your take on what the next president will need to do?
If I were advised, look, Henry Kissinger has a wonderful line somewhere in his memoirs in which he talks about the challenge of American foreign policy is, as he put it, to manage the disastrous oscillation between overcommitment and isolationism. And I think it's a wonderful line. And there's no question that under George W. Bush, we were overcommitted. I think there's no question that the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction, and my fear is that it would swing even farther. What I would tell the next president is ask yourself, what are the 5 things that you, Madam President, will not allow to happen under your watch? Make it a short list. What are those things? Ask yourself, how do you keep your nightmares at bay before you start to ask, how do you make your dreams come true? And it'd be lovely to get peace between Israelis and Palestinians, as George H.W. used to say, not going to happen. So that's a dream. But the nightmares are an Iran or an ISIS with WMD, an Iran with nuclear weapons, China in a position to control the South China Sea or threaten its neighbors at will. Russian invasion of a small NATO member state that causes a crisis in Article 5. You know, I'm happy to accept other candidates for those nightmares, but when you define your foreign policy concept negatively, you can think practically about how to manage and prevent those scenarios. When it starts to becoming something like, we're going to heal the planet and make the seas recede and solve the inequality crisis and make Gideon Rose permanently happy, then you're lost.
Three quick points.
Please quick.
Very quick. One, the fact that the U.S. economy is growing less than it should, and we would hope it should, and does not detract from the fact that it's growing more than others. And so you're comparing it against our own history rather than what other people are doing. We're actually doing better than anybody else right now because the problems we're facing.
Britain's doing better.
The second thing is one of the main reasons why things aren't doing as well is because we've had a government that is refusing to engage in sensible macroeconomic policy, sensible public investment in infrastructure, and a variety of other kinds of things, and tried to induce austerity during the middle of a recession. Government outlays have been dramatically lower on the uptick than they should have been. If they hadn't been, the recession would have been somewhat stronger. Figuring out how to deal with the major long-term problems in the economy of slow growth is crucial, but government has to be a part of that. Hopefully in the next administration with a new kind of Congress, people will realize that. And as for your nightmares, I accept some of them, but the fact is there's one missing picture, and this is the most worrisome thing about Trump, and it's something that Obama vaguely gets, but I think Hillary actually will do better at getting, and it's something that Bill recognized, as did George W. Bush, which is that the key to everything is this post-war order we've talked about, which is the United States playing as the leading member of a team rather than simply as a self-seeking independent actor. This is what Trump doesn't get. That's what his zero-sum, us, them, winning, losing thing is so idiotic about. He actually talks about South Korea and Japan as if they're freeloading people on our alliance when we benefit from a pacified Japan, when we benefit from a Europe that's basically at peace because we're providing the security. When you give Europeans responsibility for security, as Carla said, bad things happen. So what we need to do, and the key challenge for the next president, is to restore and rehabilitate and reinvigorate the liberal order. And that involves coming up with partnerships and reinvigorating partnerships with our traditional allies while helping to bring new players into the game.
Now you guys are getting to my nightmare, and so I would like us to, I'd like you to tell me why I'm wrong, or at least maybe give me some hope. And that is, it seems to me that, you know, Gideon's point about the liberal order being in some kind of a crisis and Americans not being confident that they still want to back it is a real problem. But the problem isn't just in the United States. The liberal order, the post-war social model that people had in Europe, that people had in Japan, that people aspire to all over the world, mass middle-class affluence based on mass manufacturing and mass sort of clerical employment, this is going away. It has, you know, and One result is slower economic growth here and in Europe. Another is this middle class anxiety. And that makes it more difficult for politicians in all countries to come up with good sort of plans for liberal order. It is helping to foment the rise of illiberal political movements in many countries. Now I'm afraid we have to include the United States. And it's one reason why problems in China may be so bad, that this is what they've been looking for. They've been looking to establish mass prosperity based on manufacturing, and they're probably not going to be able to do it. So there's a world crisis here, it seems to me, that is within our economy as well as internationally, that has to be somehow thought of. I'm not sure we have answers for this.
In a well-functioning debate over foreign policy and domestic policy in a serious campaign, that's the kind of thing that candidates would be addressing, and they'd be addressing it in some kind of serious way. That's obviously not the campaign we have, and we instead get diverted onto all these tracks. But I associate myself 100% with your remarks. That's a significant challenge.
Look, I mean, the point you're driving at, I think, is fundamental. And let me just talk about the political side of it, which is that, I mean, like in Tolstoy, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. We have a lot of unhappy countries, but all of them seem to be yielding a similar kind of politics. Just think about it. The leader of the Labour Party in Great Britain, one of the great parties in the West, is this lunatic, Jeremy Corbyn, who sounds like he never got out of 1979, and whose personal associations tend towards Hezbollah and all these characters. You have the rise of what I call Orbanism in Central Europe, the democratic but illiberal state. That's happened now in Poland. Marine Le Pen and the National Front keeps gaining strength in France.
Although did not do that well in the second round.
Only because the socialists, out of patriotism, threw their votes to
Le Pen.
to the Gaullists.
Sorry, to the Gaullists. Much as many Republicans may be doing this fall.
But that only is not to be discounted, and maybe I'm more of an optimist, but that only is, to me,
Right.
it tells you something.
But the National Front's stronger now than it was last time around.
So we've entered an era, and this is, I think, true in foreign policy, it's true in economic policy, in which suddenly there is this broad discontent for a variety of reasons with old-fashioned liberal democracy, with its compromises, with its corruptions, its ineptitude, its mechanisms. There's this yearning throughout the West for a more charismatic form of politics, for a politics of action rather than ideas. And this was, quite frankly, the politics of Benito Mussolini. This was, when you read Mussolini not as a caricature, but as a character in history, this was what the man represented in Europe in the 20s and 30s. And that's a comparison we really ought to be mindful of. Someone who I think is in this room, I won't say who it is, but a wise person made the observation to me, not my mom. He said, Trump is what we're getting when we have 2% growth. What happens when it's -2?
Okay. Carla.
So I don't think you can be an editorial writer, at least for the New York Times, and not believe in the perfectibility of man. So I'm going to be the optimist on the stage, which is what you're talking about and what we've been talking about is a lack of belief in American leadership, a lack of the notion of being the indispensable nation. A lot of the problems you're talking about are driven by economic realities that I don't have an answer for, which does feed the Trumps and the Mussolinis and all of that of the world. But I do believe that there still is a liberal order there. I do believe that when the socialists change that there's still a belief, but somebody's got to rally it. Someone has to do it. And the problem with Obama is not the idea of leading with your friends. It was the mistake of allowing some pipsqueak on the staff to talk about leading from behind. And there is a deficit of American leadership right now on military issues. So what I would like to hear more from Hillary, because it was Clinton and Madeleine Albright and Hillary and all these people who talked about the indispensable nation. I'd like to hear a lot more of that from her. So far, we're not hearing it from the campaign. Maybe she'll do a 180 once we get to the general. But there is a deficit certainly in the campaign rhetoric, but I still have a faith in American leadership.
Well, you know, the interesting,
I want to get to
question-
I want to get to the audience questions here. So we've got some questions from the members of the audience, so let's get to them, and we may be able to get your point in. What I'd really like to do is maybe have one panelist answer each of these so we can get to several. First question, is North Korea the #1 foreign policy problem in the world? And if yes, why yes? If no, why no? Anybody want to take that?
It's my thing's nuclear weapons. If they explode a nuclear weapon, they'll be the #1 foreign policy issue in the world. And we don't know how. They're pretty crazy, but you know, right now there are things I worry about a lot more than that.
Okay, so they're kind of the Schrodinger's cat of problems. We don't quite know if they're the #1 problem. We'll have to wait and see.
And unfortunately, it will be Dick Cheney's mushroom cloud when we do see it. That said, I don't have an answer because it's very, very hard to walk countries back once they have nuclear weapons.
Okay. Next question, or seems to be, well, there is a question here. Never underestimate Trump. If we have more Brussels and Paris American know-nothings, will they vote for him and elect him president? Can there be a Trump presidency?
No. Margaret Wente, who's a wonderful columnist for the Globe and Mail in Canada, I think put the matter correctly when she said, I do not believe the American people have gone batshit crazy. And I think that's basically right. Trump represents, you know, think about it this way. At the end of December, Trump's support in the Republican Party was, I think, something like, don't hold me to this, but it was like 37.5%. And the most recently was 37.6. So Trump has got a lock on just over a third of a Republican Party that represents about 42% of the electorate. And what it's important, I think, it's important to think seriously about what he means, but it's important to also keep a perspective. And I really do think that Americans understand that the presidency is a job that requires seriousness and dignity, and he has neither.
Of course, another 30 or 40% are going for Cruz, so it doesn't exactly make it a lot much better. I basically agree with both those answers, so I'm not going to dissent.
All right, so no Trump is our panel ruling?
Inshallah.
A friend of mine, a hedge fund manager that I'm buddies with, in 2008, when things were at their lowest, I said, you know, realistically, this can't really go into a depression. He said, well, look, there may be about a 20% chance of another Great Depression. And I said, okay, that's pretty good. 4 to 1 odds against, that's pretty good. He said, you don't understand. There should be a 0 chance of another Great Depression. That's why we're all freaking out. So, yeah, if Trump is 20%, that's, in one sense, it's the good side. There's an 80% chance no Trump. The other hand is there should be a 0% chance of it.
Yep. All right, this one I think I'm going to ask Bret to answer. Does Republican obstructionism have negative effect on the president and foreign policy?
No. I wish there were more Republican obstructionism. And I guess here Carla and I will disagree. But I wish the majority of United States senators, including 4 Democrats, including the senior senator of this state, had carried the day in stopping what I consider a calamitous deal with Iran from going through. And I think that in that sense, I mean, look, I'm a right of center guy, so I'm speaking my corner here. We have the system we have for a good reason. And checks on executive power, and so often foolish or heedless executive power, are really quite essential. And this word obstructionism, all right, is actually part of the constitutional framework that people like Madison and Hamilton and so on gave us. Sometimes it's preventing really stupid stuff from carrying the day, like healthcare reform in 2010.
So the fact is that there are some tools in the American system has formal checks and balances, and it has informal rules of the road. And what we've seen over the last few decades is not just changes or actual changes in the formal rules, but in the informal conventions. So if you take what's going on with the Supreme Court nomination right now, there's no change in actual formal rules, but there's been an informal convention that if a person is actually qualified and they're duly nominated, then you hear them out. Maybe sometimes you vote against them because you don't like their politics. But the idea that you can simply say, no, we're not going to vote because we've chosen to use our power in a nakedly political way, simply because we don't want to have it.
Now the question's about foreign
No, but so
policy.
that's an example of a trend. There's something called the treaty power of the United States. Okay, the United States has treaties, right? For much of our history, we engaged in treaties. Right now, we have a supermajority that has to pass a treaty.
We've always had that.
We've always had that, but because the Republican Party has decided that multilateralism is the work of the devil, it's essentially impossible to pass a treaty in the modern era. So what that means is you have a need to have foreign policy without treaties. Now, because no treaty, poor Bob Dole can go up in his wheelchair to the floor of the Senate and say, please pass a treaty that legitimizes the ADA. Doesn't work.
That's not true. The Republicans gave Obama a new start.
The Republicans gave
They gave him the biggest treaty of the first term of his administration.
Begging and pleading one minor little treaty that essentially codified a new state of affairs in an unsignificant way. But it's very hard to run.
Billions of unnecessary dollars for the nuclear complex was the price.
To run a liberal international order, a multilateral order, without treaty power, essentially means you have to come up with constant workarounds. So what we do is we negotiate treaties and then don't sign them. And everyone sort of understands we have these crazy, loony Republicans in the Senate, so they sort of take it for granted that we're still going to follow the treaties we've negotiated, even though we don't sign them. Or we do executive agreements, or we do other kind of things. I agree with Bret that Obama has actually used his executive powers extremely liberally and probably somewhat gratuitously. But that's because the normal powers that you'd expect that you follow from winning an election don't actually follow anymore because we've chosen to use checks and balances to eliminate the ability to carry out normal foreign policy.
Dean Acheson used to make the same argument about how hard it was to get treaties. I'm not sure just how radically. I mean, I think this has been a constant argument in American history. Woodrow Wilson had a few things to say about it too.
But I want to pose a question, a refinement of this question, which is, do you believe that if Ted Cruz were president or Donald Trump were president, that they'd walk away from the Iran deal? Do you believe if Ted Cruz, that they would walk away from, that they'd closed things down with Cuba, that they would do any of the things that they said they could do? So I think on foreign policy, the obstructionism is more hortatory than in reality.
Okay.
I think it's much easier. There's a huge inertial power. So the answer to your question specifically is no, they couldn't and wouldn't walk away from those things. But they would be very careful in entering into new kinds of things. And so there's no question, for example, you'd have no more climate change conventions or treaties.
Dead on arrival, as Condi Rice said about Kyoto, yes.
Well, Kyoto, I think, was voted 95-0 against in the Senate.
Including
with
John
Al
Kerry.
Gore, I think, and John Kerry,
Yeah.
So maybe not Gore, he may not have been in the Senate, but certainly Kerry and Kennedy.
Yeah.
So I'm not so sure that the treaty thing is new. I agree that it's a problem.
That's
That's
by design again.
Right.
The reason
But
there's
Bret,
a two-thirds majority is so that treaties will last. And one of the problems with the Iran deal is that by shoving this down the throat over so much domestic opposition, it decreases the chances, if you are in favor of the deal, of it having shelf life into future presidents.
Well, I think the other thing is that as international life has grown more complicated, the need for treaties, which used to be a fairly rare event in American life, the Washington administration didn't have to get a lot of treaties ratified, which was a good thing because the Jay Treaty was a heavy lift. But now treaties are more of a problem, and so this two-thirds question comes up more. I'm not sure there's an answer, but I think it's a real problem.
Bret on the spot. Over the next 5 years, what is your definition of the failure of this awful, terrible Iran deal? That Iran goes nuclear?
Well, it's already failing.
If Iran doesn't go nuclear over the next 5 years, will you admit that the deal was a good thing?
No, look, I don't think Iran wants to go nuclear tomorrow, or today, so to speak. It wants to go nuclear tomorrow. This is the fundamental misunderstanding. Look, To Obama, I'm going to say something nice about Obama. All right, get ready. When Obama had the full panoply of sanctions in place, right, he was able to tell the Iranians, you can have an economy or you can have a nuclear weapons program. You can't have both. And that was a good place for...
And they made their choice.
That was a great place...
At least for now.
Just for a second. That's where we wanted them to be. Then rather abruptly, and by the way, a year too soon, because if we had waited for oil prices to plummet, this deal would be looking very different. We lifted our foot off the neck of the Iranians and we said, actually, we have a new deal for you. You can have your economy now, and you can have your nuclear deal later. My daughter is 6 years old, and by the president's own admission, at the time she turns 21, the breakout time for Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon will be 0 years. If you want to see the future of the Iran deal, read what President Clinton said about the Yongbyon Agreed Framework Deal in 1994 that would better secure, would assure that that North Korea would never have nuclear weapons and would provide great security for our friend South Korea. The language, just mutatis mutandis, is almost exactly with the way we're being sold in Iran.
Something gives me the feeling that Carla wants to respond to that.
Betting on the Iranians cheating, they'll probably cheat. I think odds are, we have a better chance of catching them cheating this way than we would if we went through what we went through with Iraq. The inspectors get pulled out, we bomb the place, and we never have a clue what happens inside after that. Also, yes, if I had known the oil prices were going to drop, would I have liked to have continued it? And could I have maintained an international coalition that long? Perhaps. I will say that, that the Iranians, listen, do I trust the clerics? No. But they decided that the pressure was pretty considerable, and they are under subject, a reasonable amount of inspections, and eternal vigilance is the price.
Closed regimes have time against them. Closed economies have time against them. Isolated, autarkic regimes have time against them and do badly. The fact is that what Obama has the confidence and sense and wisdom to understand is that our systems, economically, politically, internationally, and diplomatically, are robust and have time and history on our side. And therefore, if you can postpone and pause things in ways that freeze things for the moment while letting the forces of history work in our favor, the other guys will be worse off. 10 years from now,
How
Iran...
is that different from what Clinton said about North Korea in 1990?
North Korea didn't actually open up, not least because we didn't ultimately follow through with a dramatically better relationship, and they weren't prepared to.
That's just
with
not
Iran,
true.
We're starting already to see that. With Cuba, look, we also saw the president in Cuba. And yes, there's bad human rights stuff still going on. Is there anybody who actually thinks that 10 years from now, Cuba won't be significantly more liberal than it is today?
Yes,
but sorry, that's just not true. The Yongbyon Agreed Framework was in '94. The Clinton presidency had 6 years to run. In between, you had the Sunshine Policy, you had the Kaesong Economic Complex, you had Madeleine Albright toasting Kim Jong-il in Pyongyang. And the first thing that happens when the Bush administration comes to power is they admit that they have a robust nuclear enrichment facility, uranium enrichment facility, which was later verified by Siegfried Hecker. It's just not true. And look, part of the problem with the Iran deal,
is not North Korea.
Just very quickly, the premise of the Iran deal is that we will know when they break out. We did not know when India, an open democracy and a friend of ours, decided to detonate a nuclear weapon in 1998, starting
20
an
years
arms
ago
race.
when we weren't actually even looking to.
Starting an arms race in South Asia. So to quote Daniel Patrick Moynihan, intelligence must never be mistaken for intelligence.
Carla, you want to riposte here?
Listen, I have too much experience covering the Iranian nuclear program, and they're cheaters. There's no question about it. But Iran is not North Korea. There is clearly domestic pressure. The potential for opening there perhaps will eventually have an effect. But more than anything else is that we're looking, and we're going to have inspectors in. And will they cheat, and will they get caught? I am very hopeful that will happen, that if they're cheating, that we will get caught. But what I do know is the alternative was infinitely worse. You bomb the place, the inspectors are gone, we don't have a clue what is going on there, we alienate a good part of the world, and 2 years later they have an even better nuclear program dug infinitely deeper. That's the alternative. Was I happy that they legitimized enrichment? Absolutely not. Would I have negotiated a better deal? Yes, I'm Donald Trump. I would negotiate a better deal.
No,
the deal was
you're
not.
not.
You're right, and thankfully.
Hair's the same color, but it's
No comb over, though.
yeah. I think yours is real.
But it is somewhat. The color, the inspectors are they perfect? No. Did they learn their lesson, one hopes, better from the failures in North Korea, better from the failures in other places? But in the end of the day, the alternative sucked, if you excuse my French. And that's really the reality. Right. That's what you're not negotiating against a perfect deal. You're negotiating against the reality of even more deeply buried program.
All right, we are coming to the end of our time, and I know the audience has much more interesting things to do with their evening. But before we break up, I would like to ask each member of the panel to peer deeply into your crystal ball and tell us what you think the most important foreign policy question will be in the general election campaign of this fall. What do you think the national conversation will be focusing on?
Specifically or broadly?
However, I'm asking the question. You give what the best answer that you can.
I would say that it will probably be, the Republicans will be trying to make it terrorism and ISIS, and painting Obama as weak and Hillary as weak, and saying they're the only ones who can protect the country. And I think the Democrats will be trying to make it, especially if it's about Trump, but even if it's about Cruz, as being about partnership and recklessness and the future of the order and withdrawing from the world.
Okay.
That's probably right, so I'll give a different answer.
So like his column.
Look, I think the great question of our time, and we've skirted this, is Syria. And you can take one of two views about it. You can take the view that at the end of the day, inaction is the best course of action, which I think is Gideon's view, more or less. Or you can take the view that hard as action may be, it is better than this metastasizing tumor that threatens to take down not just Syria, not just Iraq, possibly Saudi Arabia, maybe even Europe too. And is the United States in this very hard case prepared to act, not by sending 500,000 troops in there, but nonetheless prepared to act to contain this radioactive
Meaning what?
Disaster? Well, okay, just
Not 500,000, but you know what you're not in favor of. What are you in favor of?
okay. This is what I would do. First of all, I would insist that Syria cannot remain a unitary state, because so long as it is, it's a zero-sum game for power. If you divide it the way we divided Bosnia, then you have a possibility of making various warring parties, of giving them satisfaction. I would have a Kurdish area in Kurdish territories, which I would protect with a tripwire American force. I would allow the Alawites to maintain an Alawite region centered around Latakia with the condition that the Assad family has to go. And if they want the power, the protection of Russia, Russia should be included in the deal. And then you have to deal with Sunnistan, which means the destruction through a combination of limited ground forces and a massive air campaign of ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, with follow-up from the Saudis, the Jordanians, and the Egyptians, principally to police some kind of rough peace. Does this end the crisis? No, especially not around Damascus. But it begins to shrink the tumor. And you know what? I'll praise another Democratic president. Bill Clinton came to office. He read a book called Balkan Ghosts, which convinced him that no good thing could come out of U.S. intervention in the Balkan crisis. As a result, we got Sarajevo, we got Srebrenica, and he finally acted. And lo and behold, it turned out that a combination of relatively limited but decisive American military intervention, support for our proxies in the Croatian army, and some very good diplomacy by a truly talented Democratic diplomat, Richard Holbrooke, was able to end a war. So no, it doesn't always have to be Iraq over and over again. There are other models in our history. America can act, America can lead, and I hope that the next president understands that lesson rather than constantly overlearning the lessons of the past.
So the problem with colonialism and Sykes-Picot was that they weren't American. I understand now. What happened in Bosnia is not a parallel, because what occurred in that period of inaction was the endless American inaction, was that the ethnic cleansing occurred, the balance emerged, and there emerged a time of ripeness when you could actually intervene to stabilize things. That has not yet occurred in Syria. Entering now, the implication of your story is entering Bosnia in 92 would have produced the same results as entering it in 95, which I think is completely silly. We are trying to look for a way to stabilize Syria. And entering in and carving up the map of the Middle East with externally drawn lines once more when there aren't local realities to back them up, I think it's a recipe for just mindless intervention that'll get stuck there and make Iraq look like a picnic.
All right, I'm now going to ask Carla I'm going to ask Carla for the last word. And
I'm a well-behaved young woman, so I will answer your question. Although I did somewhat wanted to cheer, although I think agree with Gideon on the partition, which I think is absurd. But I do want to do something about Syria. What is going to be the issue in the campaign? I fear that it will be reactive to events. And that's what frightens me the most, particularly if bad things continue to happen out there, because that's not going to bring us to our truest and best selves. When I'm my most hopeful, I'd like to get the good Hillary back. I'd like to see the good Hillary who actually frames things in a rational way and doesn't get down in the mud with the silliness about, oh, I don't like trade and things like that, that she's felt she's had to do against Bernie Sanders. I spent a lot of time imagining a political debate between Donald Trump and Hillary, or even a political debate between Cruz and Hillary. No question in my mind that she's smart enough. The question is whether she's going to decide to lead or continue to censor herself for political reasons.
Oh, she's pandered a lot less than she might have. Look, the two big things she's pandered on are the no-fly zone and TPP. And maybe criminal justice. But, you know.
Keep going.
No, I think those are, look, when you think about the full-throated pandering that someone without principles really would have done, I think she's
I want the good Hillary back. I want the good Hillary back.
The 1992, in 1992, the Louisiana gubernatorial campaign came down to Edward Edwards, a notoriously corrupt politician, Democratic politician, and David Duke, who seized the Republican nomination. And the bumper sticker at the time was, "Vote for the crook, it's important." That's not an endorsement, it's just a reminder.
It's I think we can predict that just as the election up until now and as world events up until now in 2016 have been pretty exciting, we can look forward to more of the same. I'm more and more come to feel that democracy may be the most successful form of government, largely because it's the most entertaining. And we are certainly seeing a great spectacle of democracy this year. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you to the panel.
Thank you.
You guys have been great.